we still have a heavy rain in Bali. This rainy season, I installed new rain gutters connected to the roof. It reduces the falling water to my ground. It seems the weather getting extreme year by year. Today's podcasts focus on the extreme weather and climate change. Stay tuned and stay safe.
I was reading about that crazy hailstorm we had earlier this week. It was like Mother Nature was playing marbles, but with like giant boulders and cars. It's just wild, the kind of weather we've been having lately. Every day it seems like there's another record-breaking storm or heat wave somewhere.
Yeah, and it's not just the number of extreme events, it's the intensity, too. The science is really clear that climate change is shifting our weather patterns.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to dive into today, the connection between climate change and all this crazy weather.
Yeah.
We've got reports and articles here covering everything from global weather patterns to the economic side of it, even a specific look at what's happening in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, we've got a lot to cover. But the goal is to help you really understand how climate change is messing with our weather, what that means for the stuff we rely on, like our roads and bridges, and then the cost of all these disasters.
Okay, so let's jump in. One report said that 2024 was the hottest year on record globally. Like over 1.5 degrees Celsius, hotter than back before the Industrial Revolution. That's got to be a big deal, right?
Oh yeah, that 1.5 degree mark. Scientists have been warning us about that as a tipping point for a long time.
I guess I'm still not clear on why that specific temperature matters so much when it comes to the weather.
Well, it's all about the physics of our atmosphere. Warmer air can hold more moisture. There's this thing called the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. It basically says that for every degree Celsius warmer the air gets, the atmosphere can hold about 7% more moisture.
So it's like the atmosphere is this giant sponge that's getting bigger and soggier, soaking up more water and then just dumping it all at once.
Exactly. Think about storm Boris that hit Europe in 2024. All that record rain wasn't just bad luck. Climate change actually made the rainfall about 9% worse. And the area that got slammed with all that rain was 18% bigger than it would have been without climate change.
Wow, so 9% more rain just because it was a little warmer.
And it's not just more rain. Climate change is causing these bigger swings between wet and dry periods, too, like longer droughts followed by these super intense downpours. Scientists call it hydroclimate whiplash.
It's like the climate is on a seesaw, just going back and forth between extremes. That must make it almost impossible to predict what's going to happen.
Totally. And I think about all the stuff we rely on. Roads, bridges, power lines, even our houses. Most of it was built based on the weather we used to have, not the kind of weather we have now.
So it's like our cities and towns were built for a climate that doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly. Look at transportation, for example. Roads, bridges, tunnels, they're all really vulnerable to all this heavy rain. If the planet warms up 2 degrees, and we're getting close to that, almost half of all our transportation infrastructure could have its lifespan cut by 25%, just because of the damage from rain. And if we get to 4 degrees of warming, that number jumps to 70%.
Wow, that's scary. I never really thought about it that way. Roads crumbling, bridges collapsing, all those repairs are going to cost a fortune.
And that's just the financial side of it. We haven't even talked about the human impact, even though we have better warning systems now. 90% of the deaths from weather disasters still happen in developing countries.
Yeah, I guess those countries often don't have the resources to prepare or to recover from these big disasters.
Right. Like Hurricane Helene in 2024. That was just a tragic example of how vulnerable some communities are. Even with warnings, the damage and loss of life was just devastating.
So this is a lot to process. We've got climate change affecting how often these extreme events happen and how strong they are. All of that is putting a lot of stress on our infrastructure. And the people getting hit hardest are the ones who are already the most vulnerable.
And then on top of all of that, you have the economic cost. Between 1970 and 2021, weather-related events cost something like $4.3 trillion in losses globally.
$4.3 trillion.
And climate change is adding about $143 billion to that every year. And a lot of that cost is falling on developing countries.
So the U.S. has lost a lot of money too, something like $1.7 trillion. But that's a smaller percentage of our total wealth compared to what these disasters do to developing economies.
Exactly. Some disasters in the least developed countries have wiped out like 30% of their GDP. Like one event can just erase a third of their economic activity. It shows that the economic impact isn't just about the total dollars. It's about a country's ability to even function after one of these disasters.
Now, one region that our sources really focus on was Southeast Asia. They said it's really vulnerable to climate change. I think it would be interesting to take a closer look at what's going on there.
Yeah, Southeast Asia is a good example. It shows the whole range of climate challenges that we're facing. Just in the last few years, we've seen terrible floods in Indonesia, a record heat wave across the whole region, and powerful cyclones like Mocha.
Yeah, I remember reading about those floods in Indonesia. Places like Sumatra Barat, Cilacap, and Semarang were hit really bad. Weren't there tons of people who lost their homes in those floods?
Yeah, there were. The damage to homes and infrastructure was huge. And then you had that heat wave in 2023. It showed how vulnerable the region is to extreme heat. It affected people's health, agriculture, even the power grids were strained.
And then there were the cyclones. Cyclone Mocha hit in 2023 and caused a lot of damage in Myanmar and Bangladesh.
Yeah, Mocha showed how these storms are getting more powerful and destructive. It really highlighted how important preparedness and disaster management are.
The economic outlook for Southeast Asia is pretty scary. The Asian Development Bank said that climate change could shrink the region's GDP by 11% by the end of the century.
It's not a good outlook. It shows how closely connected climate change, economic development, and people's well-being are. But even with all these challenges, there are some good things happening in Southeast Asia.
Oh, really? I'm ready for some good news.
They're really focusing on adapting to climate change and trying to reduce emissions. For example, Indonesia is making a big push for renewable energy. And there are all these great community-led projects all over the region, focusing on things like sustainable farming and disaster preparedness. Those local efforts are making a real difference.
That's good to hear. I'd love to learn more about those efforts and what other solutions people are working on.
That's a perfect place to start in our next segment. We'll dig into some of the solutions and innovations that people are developing around the world.
Sounds good to me. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, so we've talked about how climate change is causing more extreme weather and how that's affecting our infrastructure, global safety, and the economy. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is. But the good news is it's not too late to do something about it. The same science that warns us about climate change also shows us that we can prevent the worst impacts if we act now.
So what can we do? Where do we even start with a problem this big?
Well, our sources talk about a two-part approach. First, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's the main cause of climate change. So slowing down global warming means cutting emissions.
So things like switching to cleaner energy sources, investing in energy efficiency, using more sustainable transportation, and protecting forests.
Exactly. We need to completely rethink how we use energy. It's not just about new technology, it's about changing our behavior and our lifestyles to be more sustainable. Every little thing we do makes a difference.
The reports also talked about the need for adaptation strategies, not just reducing emissions. What does that look like in practice?
Adaptation means getting ready for the changes that are already happening, making our communities more resilient to climate change. This means things like improving early warning systems, designing infrastructure that can handle the changes, and helping vulnerable communities cope with disasters.
So it's like playing offense and defense at the same time. We need to reduce emissions to slow things down, but we also need to adapt to the changes that are already here.
Exactly. And it's not just about governments and big organizations taking action. Individual choices matter too. Everything we do, from what we buy to how we travel to how we use energy at home, can contribute to a more sustainable future.
It's like that butterfly effect idea.
Yeah.
Small actions can have big consequences.
Right. Those small actions can add up and create real change. Remember those economic projections we talked about? The global economy could lose 19% of its income by 2050 because of climate change, if we keep doing what we're doing.
That's a really scary thought. And that doesn't even include the human suffering that would come with that kind of economic collapse.
Yeah, the cost of doing nothing is just too high. Investing in things like climate-resilient infrastructure, renewable energy, and sustainable practices, it's not just good for the environment, it's essential for the economy.
It seems like a social justice issue, too. The people who are least responsible for climate change often end up suffering the most from its effects.
Absolutely. We have a moral obligation to make sure that everyone, no matter where they live or how much money they have, has the chance to live in a safe and sustainable world.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how big this problem is. Are there any reasons to be optimistic?
There are. For example, transitioning to clean energy could create millions of new jobs. It could also mean cleaner air and water, healthier communities, and more energy independence.
So it's not just about preventing something bad from happening, it's about building a better future for everyone.
Exactly. It's about changing our relationship with the planet and with each other, creating a world that is both prosperous and sustainable.
So we've talked about the problem and some potential solutions. As we wrap up this part, is there one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that climate change is complicated, but it's not impossible to solve. We have the knowledge, the tools, and the resources to address it. What we need now is the will to act.
And that's where our listeners come in. We've given you the information. Now it's up to each of you to take that information and do something with it.
It's about asking yourself, what can I do to create a more sustainable future? How can I use my voice, my choices, and my influence to make a difference?
Those are really important questions. We hope you'll think about them and then take action.
We're all in this together, and the decisions we make today will determine the world we leave behind for future generations.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive: the science, the impact on infrastructure, safety, the economy. We even touched on some potential solutions and reasons to be optimistic. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with something to think about. Something that goes beyond all the data and projections.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the numbers and the technical stuff, but we got to remember the human side of climate change too. How are we as a species going to deal with this crisis on a deeper level?
So you're talking about the human story of climate change, how it changes our values, our beliefs, even our art and culture.
Exactly. The stories we tell, the art we make, even our spiritual beliefs, how will all of that change as we face the reality of a changing climate?
Will we see more art that's like a warning, showing us what'll happen if we don't do anything? Or will it be more about hope and resilience, celebrating nature and the human spirit?
Maybe we'll see both. Stories that scare us and stories that inspire us. Humans are incredibly creative and resilient. We find ways to express ourselves and find meaning even in the toughest situations.
And those expressions, whether it's art, music, books, or even just our conversations, they can be really powerful forces for change.
They can help us understand each other better and feel connected to something bigger than ourselves. Imagine a world where climate action isn't just something we have to do, but something that sparks creativity and innovation and cultural renewal, where we see opportunity in the challenge and find new ways to connect with each other and the planet.
That's a really powerful vision, shifting from fear and despair to hope and possibility.
It's about recognizing that the solutions aren't just about technology and policies. They're about our shared humanity.
So as you go about your day, pay attention to the stories you hear, the art you see, the conversations you have. How are they being shaped by our changing climate, and how can they, in turn, shape our response to this challenge? Remember, we're all in this together.
The choices we make today will decide what kind of world we leave for future generations.
That's it for this deep dive on extreme weather and climate change. We hope you learned something, thought about some new things, and maybe even felt a little inspired. Thanks for listening, and stay curious.